Weird West is an RPG in one of my favorite genres, immersive sims. Deus Ex and Dishonored are some of my favorite games and really show off what I love in games, exploring levels, discovering fun stories and characters in the environments, and is part of the reason why Arcane is one of my favorite game studios. And it just so happens that the developers of this game, Wolfeye Studios, have some of the co-creators of Dishonored and Prey, which is probably part of the reason why I liked this game so much. There are so many elements of those games ringing through in this game that I appreciated so much. It's not just an immersive sim, it is an isometric action RPG first. The story follows a bunch of characters in the Wild West as they explore supernatural stories and uncover a mystery that kind of like ties it all together. And it's definitely a format for a game that I haven't played very often. I'll start off by saying that the presentation and the overall vibe of the game is great. There is a real cohesive theme throughout the entire game. All the areas, all the writing and characters all feel like they belong in this world. It's a creepy yet melancholy and dark, interesting, supernatural world with a lot of interesting characters throughout and some unique world building that I haven't seen in other games before. The writing on the whole is pretty good. I enjoyed it for the most part. There's a lot of writing here to appreciate, like all good RPGs, so I wasn't let down in that regard. As for the immersive sim elements, they were really good too. It wasn't as deep as something like Dishonored or Deus Ex. Just because it is an isometric RPG, it's kind of hard to impress upon the player the level of interactivity and level design and interactive systems that you get from like a first person or even a third person immersive sim. But all the elements that you want from immersive sim were here, whether it be interacting with everything in the environment, finding different ways to tackle encounters, having unique and fun encounters randomly pop up over the course of your journey. Those are some of the elements that Weird West does best. And a lot of the time I was surprised with the level of flexibility the game offered, whether it be exploring the world and getting into places that I didn't think I could be able to for this style of game, or just finding little hidden secrets in the environment that aren't immediately obvious. A hallmark of a great immersive sim for me is, weirdly enough, the sound effects. Dishonored and Deus Ex, when it comes to interacting with the environment and just collecting loot, picking up things in the environment, they have fantastic sound design. And this game, I think, lives up to that because I found myself enjoying a lot of the sound effects in the game, especially the ones for looting and picking up cash. Those were great. It had a surprising amount of itemization that I didn't expect when I started. From all the weapons and items that you pick up, all the little junk items that you find along the way. There's even armor in the game. There's a surprisingly large amount of items to collect and explore in the world. It also has satisfying stealth, which I was really happy with. For me, stealth in an immersive sim is one of the most important things to get right, and Weird West, while it is simple, it is very satisfying, and allowed for some great moments in the story where I was able to truly stealth around in environments, stealth around characters, and it was very satisfying to clear out an area one by one, picking people off from the shadows. The story is told through a bunch of different characters sequentially, so you start at one character, play their story, and then move on to another character and play their story up until the end. And while the characters were definitely interesting and very varied from each other, I do think some of the stories were definitely better than others, and I did enjoy some characters more than others. They definitely weren't all the same, like it wasn't just 5 dudes with similar stories. The stories were unique and the characters were all very different from each other, which I really did appreciate. But personally, I'm not really a huge fan of this kind of storytelling. I like being immersed in one character for a long playthrough, being able to play through their perspective. It really allows me to kind of bond with the character, and in this game, I felt like I didn't really get to know the characters very well before I finished up their story and move on to the next character. And while their stories all do intertwine in a larger narrative, it does kind of let it down for me that I couldn't stick with one character throughout the entire thing. But I do understand that that is kind of the whole point of the game. You play through these multiple perspectives in the Weird West, you play their stories. That's kind of the whole point of it. As for the PC performance, for me personally, it wasn't that amazing. Some of the larger areas with a lot of NPCs and a lot of detail and things interacting with each other, it did start to chug in some areas. For the most part, it was smooth, but there were a few towns and encounters where it did suffer a bit. Combat, while fun, could be very janky. There were a lot of times where I felt like I wasn't 100% in control of my character, and since there's so many enemies and a lot of encounters, it does feel like you get overwhelmed very quickly and die very quickly, so you kind of have to plan it out and be a little bit tactical with it, which does detract a bit from the way that I think the game wants you to play, which is more run and gun with the abilities that they give you and the weapons they give you. I felt like a lot of the time if I did run and gun, I would die very quickly. Unfortunately, you did lose all of your loot for each character, so if you grinded up a bunch of loot for a specific character and got some really cool weapons, you did then have to start again with new loot, obviously, for a new character, and grind them up again. You could recruit previous characters as companions, and all your loot from your previous stories would be there, but it was a little bit tedious having to start again 100% from scratch. I did find a way to cheese it a little bit. You could put your most powerful items in the bank, in your own lockbox, and then come back to it, but I felt like that's not really the way the game wants you to do it. Like, I found that if I found a gold tier item, I was more inclined to put it in my stash towards the end of the game so I could start the next chapter with a more powerful item. And lastly, while the missions were all visually unique in a lot of ways, they did start to get very samey towards the end. I felt like you were doing a lot of the same stuff in a lot of the missions, which is kind of the nature of a lot of these games. You're doing a lot of the same similar objectives just in different locations, but with this being an isometric immersive sim, I did kind of feel the routine a bit more in this game. Overall, it's a really solid experience, and I am looking forward to playing the sequel Weird West 2. Eastward is a game that I've had on my radar for a little while, just purely for the art style. The visuals of this game are drop dead gorgeous. I'm a sucker for pixel art in video games when it's done well, and this game just visually wowed me from start to finish. As soon as the game started, gorgeous, and it was able to maintain that all the way up to the end of the game. As for what kind of game Eastward is, I would describe it as an anime-inspired adventure story. You have your two protagonists creating almost a father-daughter-like experience, you know, like your Last of Us, your BioShock. But I will say the story in this game is very different than those games. This one is much more whimsical and much more cute, while also having a lot of dark themes and somber storytelling as well. The environments were fantastic, very, very visually distinct and very well planned out. Like I said before, the quality of all of these environments was top-notch all the way through. The theming was fantastic. A special shout out to the music in this game. It was amazing all the way through. The tracks were all very, almost Ghibli-like, whimsical, but also able to convey a lot of emotion at the same time. They sounded very distinct from other video game soundtracks, which is really cool. Like I mentioned before, the story was a fun anime-like adventure story. It felt like you were going on an adventure with these characters. There was quite a bit of padding and filler to the story, which is understandable for a game like this, but it did start to drag at some points, particularly towards the end. You could feel like they were really trying to extend the runtime, which I didn't mind because it was more of a chance to explore the world and listen to the great music. The ending to the story was satisfying, but it was a little bit ambiguous. It did leave you with a lot of questions, and they weren't all answered, which I'm not expecting every story to be completely wrapped up with a nice little bow. For this kind of story, I think an ambiguous ending kind of works well for it, just because the story isn't laid out for you 100% anyway. You kind of have to piece some of it together yourself. The characters were all fun and interesting. There are so many characters in this game that are very unique from each other, to the point where there was almost too many characters that it was kind of hard to keep track of who was who. The main cast had great chemistry together. The writing was really well for the two characters. I'm not usually a fan of silent protagonists, but the main character, John, I think was really well set up, even though I do think his character does suffer a bit for being a silent protagonist. He's not 100% silent in the story itself, but for us as a player, he never actually speaks. So I do feel like that could have maybe been changed a little bit. Like, he's the strong silent type, that's his archetype for the story, but I do like it when characters are able to express themselves a little bit more through dialogue. The combat was a good challenge that actually consistently ramped up throughout the entire game. Like, there was a difficulty curve, and while it did start out pretty damn easy to the point where I didn't lose a life till I was like halfway through the game, it does start to ramp up quite consistently towards the end, of the point where I was feeling quite challenged and using a lot of the tools that the game gave me towards the end. 3 of the weapons that the game gives you are good and functional. One of them is kind of completely useless that I only use for puzzles, and outside of maybe one combat encounter that the game wants you to use it, I never felt the need to use it again. The dungeons were all really well designed in terms of exploration and combat. It was fun to explore them and make my way through them, almost Zelda-like inspired dungeons. I'm sure that comparison has been made a million times for every game that has this kind of dungeon, but that's just the comparison I can draw. And the game has a really fun system for creating your own health pickups. You find ingredients throughout the world and you cook them into dishes that you can eat with different statuses and buffs, which I thought was really cool. Just a fun way to implement the collectibles and things you find into a functioning system in the game. I really appreciated it. As for the game on a whole, it really is a good, fun adventure game with a satisfying story, great soundtrack, and amazing visuals. I don't know what else you could really ask for in a game like this. And that's it for this month. I do recognize that we have only 2 games this month, but unfortunately I have had some slight technical difficulties with my computer, which means that I wasn't able to play a whole lot of games in July, but the ones I did finish, I actually really enjoyed. Anyway, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you beautiful people in the next video.